just so thrilled to have Stephen Bennett, who's joining us straight from Scotland. Stephen, thank you so much for being with us today.
It's a real honor. Thank you very much.
We also have former Department of Defense Chief Investigator of Al-Qaeda, Mark Fallon, who has investigated some of the most significant terrorist operations in U.S. history. One of his best-selling books here, Unjustifiable Means, which is the inside story of how the CIA, the Pentagon, and the U.S. government conspired to torture, is joining us as well, a former NCIS special agent. It's just a real pleasure to have you on as well, Mark. Thank you for being here.
Thanks for having me.
So let's first talk about your relationship together in this film. Stephen, you kind of had an interesting approach to this film. You're not a veteran. You are not a new filmmaker. You've created quite a few films, and you're not a stranger to controversy. But this was sort of something that you happened upon. You read a book, if I'm not mistaken, and you realized that there was some legitimate torture that was happening. Not hundreds of years ago, not, in some medieval time, but actually in the 1950s, in the 1960s, and then moving about these things that had sort of happened, in Canada, in the United States, that happened not so long ago, and they influenced what we do, in nowadays, especially in military prisons and things like that. I mean, this really was something that didn't sit well with you. So if you might want to talk just about how you were introduced to this doctor in the first place.
So I would use, rather than introduced, I'd use the word obsessed.
Okay.
In 2007, I read an amazing book by Naomi Klein, The Shock Doctrine. And I had one of those very visceral reactions. It was 10 o'clock at night. I was reading in bed when we still read hardback copies. And I bolted up. I think it's chapter 2, and it talks about Dr. Ewan Cameron. So I'm from Scotland, a city called Glasgow. And 25 miles away from where I live was Dr. Cameron was born. And the notion that he laid the seeds for modern torture, his techniques sort of morphed from experiments in Canada in the 50s and 60s into the Troubles in Northern Ireland in the 70s and into Guantanamo and all the dark sites, fascinated me and kind of became this obsession for the next 10 years. So I spent 10 years trying to get it made, and I was making lots of other films at the same time. And every single time, whenever I'd finish a film or we'd be on a long journey with an executive producer or a friend, I would talk about this film I wanted to make. And I think everyone listened to me, but nobody really listened to me, and everyone was sort of borderline interested. And it became more and more obsession. And then about 2 years ago now, we got a little bit of money from BBC in the UK to start making it. I contacted Mark along with many of the other contributors, and we did a sort of proof of what would you call it? A proof of idea concept, which was kind of like a Skype video. Yeah. We did if you remember, Mark, we did a 10-minute Skype video, and we laid it back to BBC and another funder, Creative Scotland, which is our film funding organisation, and said, we need to make this film. And I'm very chuffed to say that they gave us some money, and we continued it. And even then, it's been shaky because people... I think your visceral reaction to it, my visceral reaction to it, most people don't want to know about it. And so getting past that desire not to have it in your head has been quite hard. But yeah, so that, I mean,
we're using the word visceral. It took me a couple of attempts. I had to keep pausing and taking breaks while watching this film. And it's not because of anything like completely... disgusting other than the concept that people were being tortured. They were using something called sensory deprivation. Before we get into talking about that, Mark, you have quite an extensive history investigating these significant terrorist operations in U.S. history. Being a former NCIS agent, being the former Department of Defense Chief Investigator of Al-Qaeda, you have said, quote, "We created Al-Qaeda in Iraq with our torture programs, and Al-Qaeda in Iraq morphed into what we call ISIS today, and we'll live for generations with what happened to the thousands of people that went through Abu Ghraib and Guantanamo." And you firmly believe that because you saw it firsthand.
Yeah, I sure did. And that's one of the problems we have. And the CIA Inspector General had sent an email to the new CIA Director Portegas, and he said that we continue to get ourselves, meaning the CIA, in messes over these interrogation practices because we fail to learn lessons. We fail to learn from our mistakes, and new generations of officers keep replicating those mistakes. And so that's what we're hoping this film does, is educate the public, like my book is meant to educate the public about really what was done in the name of the American people, and really the significant cost and consequence of that. And that's what Eminent Monsters does so well, is it puts a human face to this. You see people that I've investigated, Mohamedou Slahi and Mozambique, people that I was responsible for their investigations when they were at Guantanamo, to try to see if they would be brought to justice. And we found out there was a lot of bad information that was produced. And the bad information was produced because of the treatment and the conditions. And what Eminent Monsters does is shows the origins of that.
Yeah.
And how the weaponization of psychologists and psychiatrists, mental health professionals, and what that actually has done. And we use psychological torture rather than physical torture, not because we're more humane, because we thought the psychological torture was more devastating on the human spirit. And so that's really what I hope the public gets to see, is what is behind this, with the human faces behind it.
Yeah.
The stories and how it spread through the UK and with the hooded men, and how today we still have an appendix to the Army Field Manual, Appendix M, that has isolation in it, and that these conditions might continue in this day when we have a president that actually has a brutal streak in him and has advocated for torture.
When we get back to the film, and we're starting with Dr. Ewan Cameron in the 1950s, can you tell me a little more about the kinds of experiments he was doing? And, you speak to the isolation, we speak to sensory deprivation, the hooded men. Can you explain, first of all, what is sensory deprivation?
It's exactly how you see it, which is you remove all senses. So maybe a way to explain it better would be how someone explained it to me. So if I can put you in prison for 2 years, in the main you'll be okay, because you can see out the window, you can see people. When I remove your time and space, everything gets warped and everything gets clouded. So when someone was explaining it to me, within 24 hours to 48 hours of being in sensory isolation and sensory deprivation, you can go into a psychotic state.
24 hours.
24 hours to 48 hours. It's that quick, and it's cheap. It's almost free. I can put a hood on you and remove you into some sort of isolated room. So that's what made me kind of stand up when someone explained to me how quick it was and how easy it is, because it's very easy for me to be trained to put a hood over Mark and put him through that kind of program. Whereas if you look at physical torture, it has all contusions, there's evidence everywhere. If you look at some of the people in the film, they still talk about post-traumatic stress from something that happened during the Troubles in the 1970s. Where we're dealing 50 years on and they're still having problems. Yeah. So I guess, sorry, I'm forgetting. I'm too excited to be here.
No,
that's okay. You mentioned about Montreal. So Montreal, what Ewan Cameron did. So Ewan Cameron was one of the most eminent psychiatrists in the world. He was asked by the CIA and Canadian government to work in Montreal and work in the Allen Memorial Hospital. Now, the Allen Memorial Hospital was one of the world's foremost psychiatric institutions. It was one of the first places to have open doors so that psychiatric patients could go through and so on. So it was a very forward-thinking institution. On the other side, it had a secret wing, its sleep room. And this is where most people don't seem to sort of see the duality in Cameron. So he has this kind of forward-looking, which everyone thinks he's an amazing person. These are people who are paying to come to Cameron because he is known to be one of the world's eminent psychiatrists. On the other side, in his sleep room, they're denied all stimuli. Yeah. So they're put into rooms. They've got goggles. They've got carbo-tubing. It's all very rudimentary kind of material. But the exact same imagery you see from Guantanamo, which is the goggles, the headphones like we're wearing just now, is the same that you saw in the sleep room in the Montreal hospital.
So in the Montreal hospital, the people who are on this other side of the hospital, the sleep rooms, how did they get there?
They paid. They came. So they were selected by Cameron, and they also physically selected themselves because they saw Cameron being the world's expert in psychiatric care.
Yeah.
So they purposely went to see him thinking he was the expert, and then he would say, we've got some new techniques, cutting-edge techniques that we think that might help you. Now, one of the things that crossed the line for me as a doctor,
Yeah.
not only is he heinous to patients who are physically paying for his treatment, and you see in a film the grandson and granddaughter realising their mum lost their house because they were paying for treatment. There was a psychiatric student who just graduated who wanted to work with Cameron, and he said, "You can work for me, but you have to go through this program in the sleep room." He left her unable to recognise faces, doubly incontinent. Now, doubly incontinent is a euphemism for someone who can't, has to go back to being a baby in nappies. She was unable to progress the rest of her career. She fought continually to trying to get back into where she was as a psychiatrist. So he'd crossed a line. For me, it's a moral Rubicon. He'd crossed that line. He decided that the goal is better. Maybe I should use military terminology. I think he was like a general that said that 5,000 of my troops are going to die, but we'll win the war. And he believed at that point that he was doing for a greater good.
And that was the idea, though, when the CIA is funding this, along with the Canadian government in the 1950s. The idea, though, is that there's essentially a manual that's going to be written, and some of the practices you're going to see, Mark. I know you're seeing in Guantanamo Bay. You're seeing in some of these other prison settings, and it really was a torture manual. But the original patients were literal patients who were there for anything from, depression to other psychiatric disorders, right?
Yeah, and postnatal depression.
Oh, gosh.
You call it postpartum here in the US.
Yes.
So you go in there, you've just had a baby, you go in there and you feel that I'm going to go to one of the most eminent psychiatrists to try to get treatment. So Val Orlico. Now, you'd think she might be protected because her husband was David Orlico, who's the MP in Canada. So why would the Canadian government, be looking at attacking one of her own? You'd think maybe there might be some sort of help in that sort of sense. But all he got is blocked doors, closed doors when he tried to raise a claim against the Canadian government. These are people who are looking for looking for help when they are facing some of life's issues.
Yeah.
And they are put through this program, which then gets morphed. And it's not a straight line. You have a sense of the continuum between what happened in Montreal and to what happened in the Troubles in Guantanamo. And it keeps on changing and adapting. In the Troubles, what we did is they speed ramped it up by using physical torture at the same time as psychological torture, because they found that escalates the whole process as well.
And again, when we're talking about this film, it's called Eminent Monsters. It is actually 2 showings at the Traverse City Film Festival, both at the Bijou by the Bay, and talking to filmmaker and also Mark Fallon, who you have a book, Unjustifiable Means, that really does uncover a lot of, Dr. Cameron's initial findings, the quote-unquote manual on torture that leads into some of the practices of the United States government and of other governments in the world that are using this kind of torture therapy. Your film has been referred to sometimes as sympathetic to terrorism, but that's not the case.
No, and it's a good accusation. It's a good accusation. No, my belief, strong belief, is that when we've adopted these techniques, we've crossed a line here, and we have adopted techniques that, like you've said, Mark, in the film, that directly leads to the increase of ISIS, Daesh. I mean, Mark is the expert in this world, so I'm the documentarian. You're the expert in terms of what it's led to. But I don't believe the film is sympathetic. I think it's important that we look at what we've done as our state. Now, I'm in America just now, and I'm very glad to be in America. And this is the first time it would be seen in America. But it's very important for me. It's not an anti-American film. This is a collusion between the British, the Canadian, and American governments to create a system of systematic psychological torture. So,
and Mark, that is where, when you said in the beginning of this conversation that you utilize psychological torture as opposed to physical torture, not because you're more humane, but because it's more devastating. When folks say, well, post 9/11, the world changed and you had Americans that were angry, and they wanted something. They wanted answers. And you had a lot of people, and you mentioned President Trump having a brutal streak, and a lot of people at that time, very raw, having a brutal streak, wanting to see some sort of answers. But you write in your book, and you also are allude to in this film that doesn't work, though, because the people that were being tortured were not the ones with the answers.
That's correct. And the other problem is torture gets you information. It doesn't get you the truth. And so the problem with using a systematic process to drive someone down to an infantile state, which this was, and the psychologists were used post 9/11 just as they had been used prior to that to intensify the level of duress within the patient and the victim and the subject. What you get is you get the type of information that you want. Not the information that's the truth. And so we were driven to war, a war in Iraq, based on partially false and fabricated information from a former DOD prisoner named Ibn Sheikh al-Libi, who said under pain and torture there was al-Qaeda in Iraq. And President Bush went to Ohio and spun up the American public with the fact that the illusion there was al-Qaeda in Iraq. And Colin Powell went for the United Nations and spun up the international community with the fact that there was al-Qaeda in Iraq. And Ibn Sheikh al-Libi said he made that up so the pain would stop. And so that's the problem with these techniques from a national security perspective, from an elicitation of information perspective. It's not only ineffective, it's counterproductive. It gets you false and fabricated information, and it's information that drove us to war. And how many lives have been lost over an Iraq war that was at least justified partially by fabricated information that was conducted by implementing processes similar to what's described in Eminent Monsters. Today, 17 years later, we have 40 prisoners at Guantanamo Bay. 10 are going through some type of trial. Others are held in indefinite detention without trial from a country that was based on human rights, a country that was founded on the principle of the rule of law. And so we have abandoned those principles, partly due to that anger that we had at the time, but it's more about what we did to them than what they did to us. And that's what's most troubling about that from an American perspective, a country that was a champion for human rights.
Yeah.
And so that's the problem we're into today. And you talk about storytelling. The people who have been abused and tortured are from storytelling cultures. So these stories, just like the stories you heard in Eminent Monsters, will be handed down for generation upon generation about what we did when we invaded Iraq and Afghanistan and other countries. And we're in many countries today. And what's going on is really kind of troubling from a national security perspective and a violent extremist perspective, because we're contributing to the narrative that we're the brutal folks.
This becomes a part of the story of the family, and you said that one of the people featured in the film remarked that it's as though a branch was just taken from the family tree.
I can't think of a better way to put it. Sarah Ann Johnson in Winnipeg, internationally acclaimed artist, the second generation. Her grandmother was tortured. She was very much on her grandmother's knee as she grew up. You still see it in her when you see her. I mean, in the film you see it there, but actually even when you meet her, you realise that she's still affected. I guess we're all affected by our nature and nurture as we grow up. She was brought up with so she'd come after school and she'd go to her grandmother. She'd have lunch or dinner there, whatever it might be during the day. And her mum would go into her grandmother would go into shops and then sometimes become very erratic or screaming or, unable to be subdued because she felt something was a problem for her.
Yeah.
This is a woman who I actually think she had I could be wrong now, but I think she might have had a radio show at one point. She was a very kind of go-getting kind of woman in the 50s, really kind of... So she went to Montreal, even though we didn't live in Montreal. Winnipeg to Montreal is quite far. She was just a very dynamic woman. And then she turns into this grandmother who is incontinent, unable to recognise family, unable to be with family. I think it's quite shocking. I think we're all, a product of what we've seen as we grow up.
Right.
But this notion of breaking off a bough in a tree and the family never being able to reconcile that, I think it's a really palpable conversation. It's a good visual in terms of what happened to their family and the impact. Now, as an artist, she's still doing it. She's still making art about her grandmother. Isn't that interesting?
That is interesting. And I think about equating that story, though, about what Dr. Cameron did and the torture experiments that were taking place in Montreal. And, fast forwarding that to what you're speaking to, Mark Fallon, though, about the storytelling and about when you have this kind of secondary trauma that continues, it becomes a part of your DNA. You may have not have experienced that abuse, that torture, but you know the stories of it. You know what happened in your family, and that builds and builds for decades, which again, as you've pointed out, gives birth to Al-Qaeda, gives birth to ISIS, gives birth to whatever the next cell is, because these are the stories that are being told and perpetuating the hatred. And in this case, the torture that these families experienced that is now being perpetuated as America as the torturers.
Yeah, no doubt about it. We've made the world a more dangerous place based on torture.
Britain as well. I would say you guys are not alone.
No.
Britain had a chance to do an independent judicial inquiry about our work with America on the rendition program, and we've decided not to have a judicial inquiry. So it's not only America.
No, there are folks that believe still in the brutality and still in the information at all costs and that method of torture, that still, as you pointed out, Mark, and you said too, Stephen, they haven't learned from the mistakes. They haven't seen the pattern of what has happened, of involvement here in the 90s gives birth to Al-Qaeda, gives birth to ISIS. They haven't seen a way to stop that. Mark, do you think it's because there's no other real answer as to how to repair the relationships, the image of America after, and really to fight terrorism without using torture?
Yeah, I think the real problem is a lack of accountability. We in the United States, we had President Bush who made decisions based on fear, ignorance, and arrogance. And President Bush sanctioned torture and did so thinking that no one would ever know about it. These were black programs, covert operations that no one was ever supposed to know what we did. Unfortunately, that unraveled very quickly as torture spread. And then you had President Obama, who had an opportunity. He came in and instead of holding some type of accountability hearings, said we need to move forward and not backwards. And that offer of impunity to the torturers, with that, President Obama gave sanctuary to torture. And now we have a President Trump who celebrates it, who is encouraging it, is creating an atmosphere for a return to that type of brutal treatment. So we're in a very, very difficult position right now because of that lack of accountability, because there are still people within the government who are closely knitted to that program, closely involved. We have a director of the CIA, Jana Haspel, from her own Senate confirmation hearings testimony, was closely involved in this program. We have people within the CIA whose hands are still dirty from being involved in this program. And there's been recent testimony down at Guantanamo Bay about the role of the FBI in these programs that is still classified and is still unknown. And so until, as a country, we come to grips with what we did, we will never be able to move forward. But we need to be accountable for our actions of the past before we can then move to the next step. And some senators, Senator Pat Leahy, when Obama said we needed to move forward, he was on the Senate Judiciary Committee, said, well, then we need truth commissions. If you don't want to hold them criminally responsible, we at least need to have some type of truth commission, because those of us within the government know how utterly devastating this program was, how horrendous it was, how unprofessional it was, how violent extremism has proliferated globally based on our torture. And so until we come to grips with that fact, until these people who are currently within positions of influence within government are no longer in government positions and able to influence policy decisions, we're going to be stuck in this OODA loop where we continue to replicate these behaviors that we've had in the past. But it's accountability that we really need to come to grips with.
Can I tell you an anecdote?
Absolutely.
So all the stuff you're talking about there. So when we were full steam ahead and we were beginning to make this film, and I remember I've got 2 boys, 12 and 15, and a dog and a wife and all that sort of stuff. And I remember I'd gone down to Rabbit's Warren for 2 weeks. I'd been really intent. As soon as we started getting some money so we could really focus on making this film. And for 2 weeks I'd been going down to Rabbit's Warren of trying to find all the long stories and bits before I talked to you. And then I remember one day I read the Senate Torture Report in 2014, and I came home and I'm going to get teary again, so I was quite teary. We have got a little conservatory. I went in the back. My dog started jumping up on my leg and jump on my lap and trying to lick my face because he saw I was,
Anxious.
Dogs can. And then my sons felt. Now I'd read in the Senate Torture Report about the torture of a guy called Abu Zubaydah. And Abu Zubaydah was put into a coffin, even smaller than a coffin from memory, wasn't it? And then he had insects inside that coffin and put in there for, I forget the exact details, but let's say 2 weeks or so. Yeah, would that be right, Mark?
I'm not sure the exact time frame, but he was in isolation for 40-something days.
But he was put in a coffin, a space. Yeah. Now, this is something that Ewan Cameron did as well in his experiments in Montreal. What really got me upset was the fact that some people were sending effectively emails back to Langley saying, we're finding that this is staff who are doing this torture, finding it hard going, no longer wanting to do it. And I thought to myself, how bad does torture have to be for the people who are meting out the torture to say, I can't do this anymore? And that really put me into a very dark place because I realised I was entering something that I didn't know if I had emotional resilience to do. I'm very proud to say I've done some very strong films and very hard-hitting films. But working with Mark and some of the other contributors made me question whether I had the emotional resilience, whether I had the skill as a documentarian, whether I had the ability, or even whether I was going to let them down. You have someone like Mark on board, or Mohammed Osalahi, who's one of the most tortured in Guantanamo, over 14 years in Guantanamo. And you think, can I tell your story? Am I good enough to tell your story? And if we can tell your story, will people watch it?
Right.
And so I suppose my question in a very long-winded answer is, you said you watched a film and you could only watch it in 2 or 3 blocks.
It's true.
What made it hard for you then?
I think it was just that, not being emotionally ready for something like that. I think, I think that the film is so well done because it is very real. It's raw. The emotions are raw. You're speaking to people. You have all of this matter of fact. This did happen, but as you pointed out in the beginning, Mark, you don't want to believe that it happened. I think there's a part of me that said, "Well, wait, this can't be that bad," and then you continue to watch. You take a break, and you go, "Okay, all right, well," but it can't be that. I kept waiting for the resolution, I think, and it didn't happen. And I think that getting back to, this point when you're talking about the victims and you're talking about their families and you're talking about the folks that went through the torture, and then you bring it back to modern day and you're talking about the prisoners who have been tortured at these prisons, and you're talking about how that influences generations, there is no resolution. And that's the most disturbing part of this film, which kind of gives me, I guess what I'm about to ask is really going to be a hard question to answer. What do you hope this film will do?
It's not a hard one. I hope it makes real change. We're working with, and I'm delighted to say we're working with Professor Nils Melzer, who's United Nations Special Reporter on Torture. We're working with people like Mark and many other people behind the scenes to try to use a film as a spur to make real change, and a real and lasting change, international change in the use of psychological torture. I hope when people watch it, it has that point when they go home afterwards and they're talking to their friends or their loved ones and they're kind of going, maybe it's made them question actually what's done in our name without us thinking about it. I really hope we can make a change. People like Mark on steering committees and many other committees to try to use not only his book but also other findings to make a real difference in the use of psychological torture within the United Nations member states. That would be the biggest, would be the biggest event in my whole life, you know, if we could really make a difference, you know. I think if we could say to contributors that by them telling their story again, and for many contributors it was very hard for them to come on board and talk about things so openly again. If they could make a difference for their peers and other people who've been put through these programs, then I think we've made something remarkable.
Mark, given your position as a former Department of Defense chief investigator of Al Qaeda, as doing so many things post 9/11 and before 9/11, and being able to put the pieces sort of together and say there is a pattern, there is cause and effect, you know, other than looking at our leaders and, you know, trying to maybe change things, starting by getting new leaders involved. What do you think could happen immediately that might change the way the United States deals with interrogations without using this kind of torture?
Well, I'm on a global steering committee developing universal standards for interrogation and investigative interviewing, and we're hoping to have a resolution before the United Nations in January based on the results of the standards that we established, led by the former Special Rapporteur for Torture from the United Nations, Juan Mendez, and a number of others. And so what we're hoping that we will provide the alternative. We know torture doesn't work, and I'm formally the chair of the U.S. government's High-Value Detainee Interrogation Research Committee. So I've worked for a number of years with some of the leading researchers on what does actually make someone give you accurate and reliable information. Yeah. And so the next phase of this is, how do we now operationalize the good use of psychology, the good use of research to learn how to effectively do our job to prevent detriments to the public safety and national security around the globe. But to do that, you need to first ensure that people understand the terrible effects of torture, the terrible effects of coercion, of abuse, of isolation, the terrible effects that people have been conditioned to think worked. So that's the next phase of this. Right now, Stephen mentioned the torture report, the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence Torture Report. That's a 500-page executive summary of a 6,000-page report that continues to be hidden from the government. As horrendous as those Abu Ghraib photographs that were released, there's so many more that are still classified and will not be released because we're afraid of how that will inflame the international community. So we continue to hide, redact, and classify our torture. As you can see in my book, it's heavily redacted.
Yeah.
I currently have a lawsuit against the government represented by the ACLU and the Knights Institute for First Amendment, where we're trying to change the pre-publication review process, where the government gets to review in advance anything I publish, anything I write. I have to submit in advance to the government to look at. With my book, it was held for 233 days. There's 113 redactions, and it was only published after the Knights First Amendment Institute and the ACLU went to bat for me and threatened to take the U.S. government to court over that. And so we'll be moving to some motion hearings in September in that lawsuit with myself and 4 other former national security professionals are trying to take the government to task because of their trying to shape the narrative to meet what they want the public to believe, not necessarily the truth. And I don't believe I should be releasing classified information at all. But I do believe that I have a right to give my opinion about facts that happen. And so that's what we're fighting for. We're fighting for the public to understand what truly happened. And that's the nice part about Eminent Monsters. It really shows the human side of this. Yeah. It really shows a picture of what can happen and how quickly we can devolve and how quickly there's been, the Stanford experiments, the prison experiments, and we look at all these things that have happened in the past, but we keep going down those same rabbit holes. We don't seem to learn those lessons and change behaviors, and that's what we're hoping for. We're hoping for some activism here.
Right. Well, and getting back to Eminent Monsters, and especially with Dr. Cameron, who thought he was doing, you said this, Stephen, he thought he was doing the right thing.
Yeah, I mean, so Dr. Cameron is fairly elusive insofar that, like many people in this world, all his documents were burned. In fact, his son, who is a lawyer, burned all his documents when he left Allen Memorial Hospital. So he's a wee bit hard to untangle exactly what went through his mind. And we tried to get the daughter and the son on camera, but they refused as well, which is their right to. But that would give us another side for Cameron. So I can only suppose what I can do from all the reading I've got of him.
Right.
I believe the Nuremberg trials was a thing that altered Ewan Cameron fundamentally. Before that, I think he very much believed in the good of psychiatry.
Yeah.
Somewhere when in the Nuremberg trials where he had to go in the Nuremberg trials where he had to interview Rudolf Hess to check for his sanity, he was asked by Alan Dulles, who ran the OSS at that point, so the precursor to CIA. He said he was sane, so he could stand trial. But in his writings at that point and thereafter seems to change, and he becomes far
Something
more
happened.
darker. And I believe he became obsessed by power at that point. He started realizing that psychiatrists should tell you whether you could have children, what kind of job you should have. So they become the overlords of our world, if you like. And he became more and more obsessed by that. And I think that's the slope he went on to. I would certainly love to have had the Cameron's siblings, Cameron's children on camera to try and get their sense of him. But no, I think we have to realize that we have to hold psychiatrists to account as well. You know, if they're going to work with the military and be deeply ingrained in the military in warfare, then we have to sort of hold them to account as well.
And Mark, you mentioned after 9/11, President Bush operating out of fear and ignorance and arrogance, and that kind of continuing, you know, when there was an attack on the country, and I think we all sort of operated out of that for a bit. You know, it almost feels like it's sort of your caveman brain, if you will. It's fight or flight. It's I'm going to win before you can win. That's what it feels like. But we have been now removed enough, and we're supposed to have learned enough that we come up with different ways of doing things that are not only going to get accurate information, so we're not putting the men and women of the United States military into operations that will that will bring nothing for our intelligence, but also that really that you know, fight terrorism in the way that we really need to be fighting terrorism, which is by looking at our own image first.
Yeah, the real shame of this, when history does look back at this, is the fact that we knew how to do this job and do it well. The FBI for years had a Osama bin Laden squad. I worked with them on the first Trade Center bombing and the Blind Sheikh case on the USS Cole attack. And so we knew how to do this job. It was the attack of September 11th when President Bush kind of abandoned the Constitution. You know, he decided that the constitutional courts, the Article 3 courts under our Constitution, were not an effective method to bring terrorists to justice. And that actually is not a factual statement. The federal courts had been a very effective method to bring terrorists to justice. And the FBI was a very effective agency, and the Joint Terrorism Task Force in New York City with NYPD that I worked with for years was very good at their job. But we abandoned that and we turned to the CIA. And in November of 2001, there's internal documents now that have been declassified and released on the CIA's website where they made a conscious decision to implement torture, knowing it was a violation of international law. So you had people making policy decisions that had no experience in doing these interviews and interrogations. The experience they did have from the 60s and the 50s and in the Kubara Counterintelligence Manual, which implements the same things that Eminent Monsters describes, and the MK Ultra program that the CIA had operated for years, use this research for unauthorized purposes. So they used the research that you saw Cameron do to try to get information. But the question is, if you know the information is false, was it done intentionally? So the question that people need to ask themselves, if you know what we know and what we knew then about the false and fabricated information that comes out of someone who is debilitated like this, was that policy decision a conscious one to get information to support war?
This film, this film is a gut punch. It really is. It's something that I think people should watch with open eyes. This is something that you will have a reaction to, a visceral reaction. The blending of, things that I think we talk about quite a bit when it comes to post 9/11 world, and when it comes to Guantanamo and Abu Ghraib, and all of these things that we it almost feels like sound bites in the media, that it has become so commonplace to talk about that, married with real people, stories of surviving these experiments with Dr. Ewan Cameron, does make you look at things differently. I think if this were just a film that focused on the military operations and not the human side of it, it would be different. But it has both, and it does things so well.
Well, that's a huge honour. Thank you very much. I mean, it's hard to get people to watch this because
it's a tough film.
It's a tough film to watch. It's a tough film to sell. It's a tough film to go and see, And part of this is trying to get people to do it. So this is great to be on the show with you. I mean, I believe in the film has a right. When I was growing up, I remember the book, was it Shylock, An Eye for an Eye? Mm-hmm. It becomes ingrained in us, doesn't it? Someone hurts my family, I have to go for retribution. Mark hurts my family, then I have to go after Mark. Yeah. It's ingrained in our DNA. I think we have to box more clever here, when we have to look at what we're doing. Mark's notion that we are affecting generations going forward by our techniques is really damning. But the trick is, how do we get people to voluntarily come to watch a film like Eminent Monsters? And that's the difficulty, because I think once we get people... you had a reaction to the kind of imagery, which is what we try and do, get people as close to being inside the hood as possible.
Absolutely.
So in the cinema, I don't know what your TV setup, but in the cinema, it's really it's a bit of a rollicky ride. Now, we had a premiere in Glasgow in Scotland, and my sister grabbed my arm at one of the parts. This is Mohammed Salahi talks about being interrogated with a sort of a heavy metal track in the background. And I remember her grabbing my hand at this point, because it does make you feel intense. The same with the hooded men. There's a scene there as well. It's all about what's happening to the brain, and what we're doing, what our people who are supposed to lead us are doing to people in our name. And that's what we've got to try and get people to come and watch, isn't it? How do you get people past the notion of they think they know the story about Guantanamo, they think they know the story about hooded men or what happened in the Troubles? Because I certainly felt I did.
Well, and a great takeaway here, and I think a message that is going to sound a little more simple than it really is, but that is to remember that, especially here in America, the government is for the people, by the people, and not to not to underestimate the fact that the government is keeping things from us, and is definitely doing things, I believe, that maybe violate some of those basic human interests, but to not be afraid to watch this, because clearly I was able to do it, and it was tough, but it's necessary. I think this is how we start things. You mentioned changing out the leadership, but the leadership starts with the people. So educating the people as to what the reality is in these circumstances, the patterns that don't work, and to figure out a way to break those patterns. Both of you have just been fantastic today. Thank you so much for being with us. There are 2 opportunities to see this film, both at the Bijou by the Bay. I would encourage you to go online to get tickets right now. I have a feeling it's going to sell out. This is an intense film. It's definitely something you want to see. Bring a friend and be prepared to have a long conversation after the fact about everything, not just about the film, but really about how it relates to people today. And pick up the book Unjustifiable Means while you're at it, too, with Mark Fallon, who's a former NCIS special agent. And this is the inside story of how the CIA, the Pentagon, and the U.S. government conspired to torture. It all goes very well with Eminent Monsters. Thank you both so much for coming in today. It's just been a real pleasure. together.
And Crystal, can I just add, we're going to have questions and answers after each showing of
Yeah.
Eminent Monsters, so we'll be there. And then after Thursday's showing, we'll be moving down to Brilliant Books, and I'll be signing copies of Unjustifiable Means, and we'll continue the discussions there.